No one in Dunar Hollow believed the storm was real. They drove past the man on the ridge, laughed at the way he dragged massive beams through the mud, and told themselves the sky had always looked like that. But the air was already holding its breath, and the man they called crazy was building the only place that would still be warm when the world finally went silent. The air over Dunar Hollow did not move. It hung heavy and gray, thick as wet wool, pressing down on the jagged peaks of the northern ridges. To the casual observer, it was merely a dull autumn afternoon, but to Orrin Calder, the atmosphere felt like a held breath, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Orrin's rusted pickup truck, a battered workhorse of dented steel and fading blue paint, groaned as it bounced over the rutted track, leading to a desolate clearing. The tires spat gravel against the silent pines that stood like ancient judgmental pillars. Orrin pulled the brake, the metallic screech echoing through the woods, and for a moment he simply sat there. His eyes, sharp and restless, scanned the tree line. They were the eyes of a man who had spent years looking for threats in the periphery, eyes that never truly found rest, even in the supposed peace of civilian life. Beside him, Sable, a lean German shepherd with ears perpetually forward, let out a low whine. She felt it too, the subtle shift in the barometric pressure, the way the birds had stopped their chatter. Orrin reached out his calloused hand, resting briefly on the dog's head. "I know, girl," he whispered, his voice like grinding stones. "It's coming." Orrin stepped out of the truck. Every movement was deliberate, a symphony of muscle memory and calculated effort. He walked to the bed of the truck, which was piled high with massive pressure-treated lumber beams thick enough to support a bridge, let alone a simple woodshed. To anyone in town, the amount of wood was absurd. To Orrin, it was the bare minimum. He began the grueling task of unloading. He didn't use a winch or a ramp. He shouldered the beams, his boots sinking into the damp earth as he dragged the heavy timber toward the center of the clearing. Each step was a battle against gravity, and the lingering aches in his joints, reminders of a service that had taken much from him but left him with an unbreakable will. The clearing was situated near a bend in the main road that led deeper into the mountains. It was a high-traffic spot for the locals, heading to the lumber mills or the high country trails. It didn't take long for the first spectators to arrive. A shiny, modern SUV slowed down as it passed the clearing. The driver, a man named Harlan Beck, who owned the local hardware franchise, rolled down his window. He leaned out, a smirk playing on his face, as he watched Orrin struggle with a 12-foot post. "Hey, Calder," Harlan shouted, his voice dripping with condescension. "Building a skyscraper for the squirrels? Or are you finally admitting you've gone completely woods crazy?" Orrin didn't look up. He didn't break his stride. He reached the spot where he had marked the earth with stakes and dropped the beam. The thud was deep, vibrating through the soles of his boots. Sable, however, let out a sharp bark, her hackles rising. Orrin whistled softly, a command for silence, and the dog immediately sat, though her amber eyes remained fixed on the man in the SUV. "Leave him be, Harlan!" A passenger laughed from inside the car. "He's probably building a monument to his own shadow. It's the only thing that stays with him anyway." The SUV sped off, the sound of their laughter lingering in the cold air like a bad smell. Orrin ignored them. He had long ago ceased to care about the opinions of those who lived in the warmth of unearned security. They saw a crazy vet building a shed where no house stood. They saw a man wasting his strength on a structure that had no purpose in a world of central heating and digital maps. They didn't see the patterns in the clouds. They didn't hear the way the wind hummed a different tune through the needles of the pines, a low, mournful frequency that spoke of ice and isolation. Hours passed. The gray sky darkened into a bruised purple as the sun dipped behind the ridges. Orrin's shirt was damp with sweat, despite the dropping temperature. He had cleared the perimeter and begun the primary framing. This wasn't a shed. It was a fortress disguised as a utility building. The floor joists were doubled, the corner posts sunk deep into the rocky soil and anchored with heavy-duty bolts. Another truck pulled over, this one, a beat-up farm vehicle. An older man, a local farmer who had known Orrin's father, stepped out. He walked to the edge of the clearing, watching Orrin work with a mixture of pity and curiosity. "Orrin," the old man called out softly. "Son, why out here? The town says you're putting all your savings into this shed." Winter is coming, sure, but the valley is where the heat is. Why build something so heavy in the middle of nowhere? Oren stopped for a moment, leaning against his mallet. He looked at the old farmer, seeing the kindness in his eyes, but also the blindness. "The valley is a trap, mister," Henderson Oren said quietly. "When the big one hits, the roads will vanish. The power will go. The valley becomes a bowl of ice. Up here you have a chance, if you have a hearth that doesn't rely on a wire." The farmer shook his head, sighing. "You've always been one to look for the storm even on a sunny day. Take care of yourself, Oren. Don't let the mountain swallow you whole." As the farmer drove away, the mocking returned. A group of younger men, emboldened by a few drinks at the local tavern, stopped their truck and began tossing empty cans toward the edge of the clearing. "Hey, Oren. You planning to heat the entire forest with that thing?" one of them yelled. "You're building a wood palace for a winter that's never gonna come. Why don't you come inside and get a real drink instead of playing with sticks?" Oren stood in the center of his unfinished foundation. The insults drifted past him like dead leaves. He reached for his heavy wooden mallet. His hands, scarred and steady, gripped the handle. He didn't yell back. He didn't offer an explanation. Instead, he raised the mallet high above his head. With a grunt of focused power, he brought it down onto the head of a corner post. Thwack! The sound was immense. It wasn't the hollow sound of a carpenter at work. It was the sound of a heartbeat, a rhythmic, booming strike that echoed off the granite faces of the mountains. It drowned out the laughter of the men. It silenced the wind. Thwack! Oren struck again. Each blow was a testament to his preparation. Each strike was a wall being built between his past failures and the future he refused to lose. He remembered the mountains of his youth, the way the cold could remove a person's spirit before it even stopped their heart. He remembered his brothers in arms who had faded in the shadows of distant peaks because they lacked a place to hide from the elements. The men in the truck grew quiet, unsettled by the raw intensity of Oren's labor. The sound of the mallet was too deliberate, too powerful. It felt less like construction and more like a ritual. They shifted their truck into gear and sped away, leaving Oren alone with the forest and his dog. Sable walked over to the post Oren had just driven in. She sniffed the wood, then looked up at her master, wagging her tail once. She understood. The foundation was set. Oren wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his glove. He looked up at the northern ridges where the first flakes of white, not snow but something grittier like ash, began to dance in the fading light. The world was beginning to change, and the people of Dunar Hollow were still laughing in their brightly lit homes. Oren picked up another beam. He had much work to do before the silence became absolute. "Let them laugh, Sable," he whispered, the mallet rising once more. "The mountain doesn't care about their jokes, and neither do we." The sound of the mallet continued long into the night, a steady, rhythmic pulse in the dark, marking the beginning of the end of the world as they knew it. The sun hung at its zenith, yet it offered no warmth, appearing more like a pale silver coin tossed into a frozen sea. The air around the Dunar Hollow ridges had grown thin and brittle, the kind of cold that didn't just sting the skin but seemed to vibrate against the bone. Oren Calder didn't mind. His breath came in steady, rhythmic plumes of white vapor, matching the pace of his hammer. The shed, as the townspeople called it, had grown significantly since the previous day. It was no longer a mere skeleton of wood. Oren had begun layering the exterior with heavy grade-treated planks, but it was the internal framing that would have confused any ordinary carpenter. The studs were placed barely 6 inches apart, and the crossbeams were thick enough to support the weight of a locomotive. Sable, his loyal German shepherd, suddenly stood up from her bed of dry pine needles. Her ears pricked toward the south, trail a low, inquisitive whine, vibrating in her throat. Oren didn't stop his work. He didn't need to. He knew the sound of a professional's gait, the steady, deliberate crunch of boots that understood how to navigate uneven terrain without wasting energy. A figure emerged from the veil of frosted pines. It was Marin Quill, the high-altitude ranger responsible for the northern sector. She wore the standard-issue dark green parka, her gear meticulously maintained. Marin wasn't like the locals who drove by in their heated trucks to shout insults. She was a woman of the heights, someone who had looked into the eyes of the mountain and learned to blink second. She stopped 10 paces from the clearing, her eyes immediately scanning the site. She didn't look at Oren first. She looked at the foundation. "That's a lot of stone for a woodshed, Oren," she said, her voice clear and resonant in the quiet woods. Oren lowered his mallet, turning slowly. He gave a short nod of acknowledgement. "The ground here shifts when the deep freeze sets in. I don't want it walking away on me." Marin walked closer, her gaze moving upward. She noticed the roof's pitch, an aggressive steep angle designed not just to shed snow, but to prevent the massive accumulation that could crush a standard home. She saw the way the corners were notched and bolted with galvanized steel plates. "You're not building a shed," Marin whispered more to herself than to him. She stepped onto the elevated floor, jumping slightly to test its resonance. It didn't vibrate. It felt like standing on solid rock. This flooring, it's reinforced for weight. Heavy weight. And it's 3 feet off the forest floor. Why? Oren wiped a layer of frost from a nearby beam. Airflow prevents the floor from becoming a heat sink. And when the snow reaches 5 feet, I still want to be able to open the door. Marin's expression shifted from curiosity to a mounting professional concern. She looked at the reflective insulation Oren had begun to tack onto the interior walls, material usually reserved for high-end survival bunkers or industrial cold storage. "The town thinks you finally let the solitude get to you," Marin said, leaning against a post. "They're down there at the tavern, betting on how long it'll take for this monument to madness to fall over. They've forgotten what a real winter looks like," Oren replied, his voice a low rumble. "They think comfort is a permanent state of being. They think the power lines are umbilical cords that will never be severed." Marin walked to the edge of the structure and looked out toward the northern horizon. The sky there was a bruised purple, a color that didn't belong in a standard weather cycle. As a ranger, she had access to the advanced meteorological data from the peak stations. The readings had been anomalous. "The barometric pressure is dropping faster than I've seen in 12 years, Marin admitted, her voice dropping an octave. "The weather patterns are becoming stubborn, Oren. The high-pressure systems are boxing in a cold front from the Arctic. It's not moving. It's just sitting there gathering mass." "It's not just sitting," Oren corrected. "It's waiting." Marin turned back to him, her eyes searching his face. She saw the soul wounds in the lines around his eyes, the marks of a man who had seen things end in the dark. She realized then that Oren wasn't acting on a whim or a breakdown. He was acting on a memory. "How bad do you think it will be?" she asked. Oren stepped toward the edge of the deck, standing beside her. He pointed toward the town of Dunar Hollow, nestled in the valley below. From this height, the town looked like a toy set, fragile and sparkling with premature holiday lights. "The town is built on the floor of a funnel," Oren said grimly. "They've cleared the trees that used to break the wind. They've relied on a single road for their fuel and their food. When the storm refuses to leave, when it settles in for a week or 2 or 3, that valley won't be a shelter. It will be a tomb of ice." Marin felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I've tried to tell the mayor to winterize the community center. He told me the budget was spent on the new festival lights." Oren let out a short, humorless breath. "Lights won't keep a child's heart beating when the mercury disappears into the bulb. You can't eat a festival, Marin." "I can order an evacuation of the higher trails," Marin suggested, her mind racing through protocols. "The trails aren't the problem," Oren said, looking at her with a piercing intensity. "The people are. They won't leave their castles until the walls start to freeze. And by then, the roads will be gone. The North Slope will be the only place where the wind won't bury you alive because the trees here are old. They know how to stand." He turned back to his work, picking up a heavy roll of weather stripping. The conversation was over for him. There was no time left for debate. Marin stayed for a moment longer watching him. She looked at Sable, who was watching her with an intelligence that felt almost human. The dog's coat was thick, already prepared for the coming onslaught. Oren Marin called out as she began to walk away. He paused his hand on the wood. "If it gets as bad as you think, if the world truly turns white, will you leave the door unlocked?" Oren didn't look back. He simply struck a nail with a force that echoed through the entire ridge, a sound like a gavel bringing a court to order. "The door is for those who realize they are lost," Oren said. "The heat is for those who want to find their way back. I don't lock doors against people who are shivering." Marin nodded, a silent pact formed between the veteran and the ranger. She began her descent back toward the town, her pace much faster now. She had reports to file even if no one would read them. She had warnings to give even if no one would hear them. Behind her, the sound of the hammer continued. It was the only sound left in the forest. The birds had already departed. The squirrels had vanished into their hollows. The entire natural world was pulling its breath in, bracing for the impact. Orin watched Marin disappear into the trees. He knew she was one of the few who understood the language of the wild, but even she didn't realize the full scale of the fading that was coming. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver compass. The needle was spinning erratically. The magnetic field was in flux, a precursor to the atmospheric wall that was about to collapse upon them. "Not much longer, Sable," he whispered. The dog let out a soft huff of agreement. Orin looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, and steady. He had failed to protect his brothers once before, in a place where the air turned to glass. He had carried that weight for a decade, a ghost that followed him through every city and every job. But here on this ridge, he was building a different ending. He wasn't just building a shed, he was building a second chance. As the first gray flake of the afternoon drifted down, landing on the dark wood of the fortress, Orin didn't brush it away. He watched it. It didn't melt. It sat there, a tiny, jagged herald of the silence that was about to swallow the world. The town of Dunar Hollow was still laughing, the glow of their television sets visible in the distance. But up on the ridge, the man who knew the truth was picking up the last of the heavy beams. The time for talking had ended. The time for survival had begun. The transition from the golden hues of autumn to the monochromatic grip of winter usually happened with a frantic wind and the rattling of window panes. But this time, the atmosphere did not scream. It held its breath. As dusk settled over Dunar Hollow, the town looked like a postcard of rural serenity. In the windows of the small shops along the main street, warm orange lights flickered. Wreaths of dried pine and ribbons were already being hung in anticipation of the upcoming festivities. The smell of cinnamon and roasting meat wafted from the kitchens of the local diners. To the average resident, it was just another cold evening, perhaps a bit more humid than usual, but nothing that a thick sweater and a sturdy hearth couldn't handle. However, for those who knew the language of the earth, the air felt different. It felt heavy, thick, like water filling a basin. The barometric pressure was dropping so sharply, it made the ears of the elderly ache, and the local livestock turned their backs to the north. There was a suffocating quality to the stillness. No birds chirped. No squirrels scampered across the frozen mud. Even the wind seemed to have retreated, leaving behind a vacuum of silence that felt more threatening than any roar. 3 miles up the ridge, Orin Calder felt the shift in his very marrow. He didn't need a barometer to tell him the trap was about to spring. Inside the reinforced shell of his structure, Orin was working with a rhythmic, desperate efficiency. The exterior of the shed looked like a rugged, oversized woodbin, but the interior was becoming something far more sophisticated. He was currently unrolling thick sheets of reflective industrial-grade insulation. The silver material caught the dim light of his battery-powered lantern, casting long, distorted shadows against the timber walls. This was the inner sanctum, a room within a room. He stapled the insulation with precision, ensuring every seam was airtight. This wasn't just about keeping out the breeze. It was about creating a thermal envelope that could trap the heat of a single candle if necessary. He knew that when the mercury plummeted, the biggest threat wasn't just the cold, but the loss of one's own internal fire. Sable sat in the corner, her ears twitching. She wasn't resting. Her head was tilted toward the ceiling, listening to the sounds that the human ear couldn't yet detect, the groan of the massive timbers settling under the invisible weight of the changing air. Every few minutes, she would let out a low, vibrating growl deep in her chest. "I hear it too, girl," Orin muttered, his voice raspy from the sawdust and the cold. "It's settling in. No way out now." He moved to the center of the room, where a small cast-iron stove sat bolted to the floor. It was a modest thing, but it was the heart of the fortress. He checked the venting pipes one last time. They were angled to prevent snow blockage, a trick he'd learned in a place the world had forgotten. He ran his hand over the smooth metal. Around the stove, he had stacked cords of seasoned oak and birch, dried to the point of being brittle. It was enough fuel to last a month if used with the discipline of a soldier, Back in town, the atmosphere was far less disciplined. At the Rusty Lantern, the local tavern, the laughter was loud and the beer was flowing. Harlan Beck was holding court at the end of the bar, mimicking Oren's stooped posture as he dragged a log. "I'm telling you," Harlan laughed, taking a long pull from his mug. "The man's lost his gears. He's up there building a palace for squirrels while we're down here enjoying the best season of the year. He thinks he's Noah, and the ridge is his Ararat. Only problem is, there ain't no rain coming, just a little dusting of the white stuff." A few men chuckled, though some of the older residents looked toward the darkened windows with a hint of hesitation. The sky outside wasn't dark in the way a night sky should be. It was a bruised, sickly, purple gray, and it seemed to be descending, pressing down on the rooftops. Then the first flake fell. It didn't drift like a feather. It dropped like a stone. It was a heavy, wet, ash-like flake that stuck instantly to whatever it touched. Within minutes, the dusting Harlan had predicted turned into a vertical white wall. This wasn't the light powdery snow that tourists loved. This was the heart of the storm, heavy, dense, and full of moisture. It was the kind of snow that didn't pile up. It accumulated like wet cement. In the forest, the silence was replaced by a new sound, the groaning of the pines. The trees were used to the wind, but they weren't prepared for this weight. The snow clung to every needle, every branch, doubling the weight of the canopy in a matter of an hour. Oren stepped outside his shed for one final check. The world had vanished. He couldn't see 5 feet in front of his face. The silence had returned, but it was a muffled, dead silence, as if the world had been wrapped in a thick wool blanket. He looked up at the power lines that ran along the ridge toward the town below. They were already sagging, coated in an inch of gray ice and white sludge. They hummed with a low, vibrating frequency, a mechanical moan of distress. "Time's up," Oren said. He whistled for Sable, who didn't need to be told twice. They stepped inside, and Oren swung the heavy, triple-bolted door shut. He dropped the wooden crossbar into place. The sound of the latch clicking home was final. The fortress was sealed. In Dunar Hollow, the mood began to shift from merriment to unease. The festive lights on the main street flickered once, twice, and then turned a dull, sickly yellow as the transformers struggled against the load. Suddenly, a sound like a gunshot echoed through the valley. It was the sound of a century-old oak tree giving up. Near the edge of town, the massive tree laden with thousands of pounds of wet snow split down the center. With a slow, agonizing roar, it toppled forward. It didn't just fall, it crushed. It descended directly onto the town's only fuel station, the roof of the pump canopy, buckling like a tin can. The power lines connected to the station were ripped from their poles, sending a cascade of bright blue sparks into the white void. In the tavern, the lights went out instantly. The jukebox died mid-chorus. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, broken only by the sound of the wind finally beginning to pick up a low, mournful howl that sounded like a predator circling a camp. Harlan Beck stood up, his face pale in the dim glow of the emergency exit sign. "It's just a line down," he said, though his voice lacked its previous bravado. "The crews will have it up in an hour." But as he looked out the window, he saw something that chilled him more than the temperature. The road was gone. The cars in the parking lot were already half buried, not by drifts, but by the sheer volume of the falling sky. The trap had closed. The roads were impassable, the power was severed, and the fuel that kept the town's backup generators running was trapped beneath tons of wood and metal. Up on the ridge, Oren Calder sat in his chair, the small stove beginning to radiate a gentle, life-sustaining warmth. He didn't feel joy at being right. He only felt the heavy burden of the long night ahead. He reached down and patted Sable's head. "The laughter stops tonight," Oren whispered to the shadows. "Now we see who was truly ready." Outside, the world turned into a white abyss, and the town of Dunar Hollow began to realize that the man they had mocked was the only one who had seen the wall coming before it hit. The world outside the shed had ceased to be a landscape of trees and earth. It had become a screaming white void. The wind did not merely blow. It hammered against the reinforced walls of Oren Calder's structure with the rhythmic violence of a battering ram. Inside, however, the atmosphere was a stark, defiant contrast. The air was thick with the scent of seasoned cedar and the dry, comforting heat of the small cast-iron stove. Oren sat on a low wooden crate, his large, scarred hands hovering near the stove's belly. The orange light from the vents flickered across his face, carving deep shadows into the lines of his forehead and the corners of his eyes. Every few minutes, the structure would groan a deep wooden protest against the atmospheric pressure, but Oren didn't flinch. He knew every joint, every bolt, and every support beam. He had built this place to be an island in a sea of ice. He reached for a split log of oak, tossing it into the fire. As the flames licked the wood, the crackling sound triggered something deep within him. The sound of the fire began to morph. In his mind, the snapping of dry wood became the sound of radio-static crackling, desperate and distant. The walls of the shed seemed to dissolve, replaced by the jagged, unforgiving peaks of a mountain range half a world away. Oren was no longer in Dunar Hollow. He was back in the Gray Ridges, a high-altitude pass where he had once led a squad of young souls. They hadn't been lost to an enemy they could see or fight. There were no projectiles, no explosions. There was only the silent thief, the extreme, indifferent cold. He remembered the way the air felt that night, so cold, it felt like breathing powdered glass. He remembered his second-in-command, a bright-eyed youth, who had talked incessantly about his mother's cooking, slowly growing quiet. They had been pinned down by a storm that lasted 72 hours. They had followed every protocol, huddling together for warmth, but the cold was a patient hunter. It didn't rush. It simply waited for the fire of the human spirit to flicker low. One by one, the voices had stopped. Oren had moved from man to man, shaking them, rubbing their frozen limbs, shouting commands that the wind swallowed whole. He had watched as the light faded from their eyes, not with a bang, but with a gentle, terrifying drift into a sleep from which they would never return. He had been the only one left standing when the helicopters finally broke through the clouds days later. He had survived, but he had carried their silence home with him. That was his soul wound. It wasn't the physical scars of service that haunted him. It was the memory of being unprepared for the elements. He had promised the ghosts of his squad that he would never again let the cold win. He would never again be the man who watched others fade away because the walls weren't thick enough or the fire wasn't bright enough. Every nail he had driven into this woodshed over the past months had been an act of penance. Every mocking laugh from Harlan Beck and the townspeople had been a dull echo compared to the screaming winds of the Gray Ridges. He hadn't built this shed out of madness. He had built it out of a sacred debt. A low whine broke his trance. Sable the German shepherd had noticed the change in Oren's posture. The dog saw the way Oren's heart rate had spiked, the way his breath had become shallow and ragged, as the past threatened to overwhelm the present. Sable rose from her rug and moved to Oren's side, nudging his calloused hand with her wet nose. She leaned her heavy weight against his leg, a grounding force in the midst of his internal storm. Oren blinked the mountain peaks of his memory, receding back into the shadows of the shed. He felt the warmth of the stove on his skin and the solid reality of the dog at his knee. He took a deep, shuddering breath, smelling the pine and the heat instead of the frozen ash of the past. "I hear you, girl," Oren whispered, his voice gravelly and low. He reached down and buried his fingers in Sable's thick fur, feeling the steady thump of her heart. He looked toward the door. The wind was reaching a new crescendo, a shriek that sounded like 1,000 lost voices. But the shed didn't buckle. The beams held. The insulation kept the warmth trapped inside a golden pocket of life in a dying world. Oren looked at the extra blankets stacked in the corner, the crates of dried food, and the rows of water jugs. He wasn't just waiting for the storm to pass. He was waiting for the moment he knew would come, the moment when the people of Dunar Hollow would realize that their homes were no longer sanctuaries. "Not this time," Oren said to the shadows, his voice firm and filled with a grim, protective resolve. "This time, the silence stays outside." He stood up, his joints popping, and walked to the small, reinforced window. He wiped away a circle of frost to peer out. He couldn't see the town anymore, but he knew the darkness there was absolute. The trap he had foreseen had snapped shut. Now it was only a matter of time before the first desperate knock arrived at his door. The warmth of the shed was a fragile miracle, a pocket of defiance against a world that had turned into a white abyss. Orrin Calder sat by the stove, his hand resting on Sable's head, listening to the mountain scream. It wasn't just wind anymore. It was a physical weight, a roar that threatened to crush the very air out of one's lungs. Suddenly, a sound broke through the rhythmic howling, a frantic, uneven pounding on the reinforced oak door. Sable was up in an instant, a low growl vibrating in her chest, but her ears were forward, sensing the familiarity of the scent even through the cracks. Orrin stood his movements methodical despite the sudden surge of adrenaline. He unlatched the heavy iron bolt. The door didn't just open. It was blasted inward by a wall of frozen air. With it came Marin Quill. The ranger was nearly unrecognizable. A crust of ice clung to her eyebrows and the fur of her hood. She stumbled into the room, her knees buckling as the sudden shift from sub-zero temperatures to the shed's warmth hit her like a physical blow. Orrin caught her by the shoulders, steadying her. "The bells," she gasped, her voice a ragged whisper, her lungs struggling to adjust. "The North Slope cabin. The old logging trail. I tried to get to them, but the road is gone. It's all gone, Orrin." Orrin's eyes narrowed. He knew the Bell family. Lysa, a widow who worked at the local clinic, her young son Toby, and her father Elias, whose legs weren't what they used to be. "The cabin has a wood stove," Orrin said, his voice calm, grounded. The chimney Marin choked out, shaking her head. "I saw it from the ridge, before the whiteout swallowed everything. The ice buildup, the flue is capped shut by the freezing rain. They can't light a fire, Orrin. If they do, they'll choke on the smoke. If they don't, they won't make it to dawn. The fading sleep is already setting in. I could see the lights flickering out." Orrin didn't ask if she was sure. He didn't ask why the town's emergency services weren't responding. He knew the truth. The town was paralyzed, buried under the weight of its own lack of preparation. He was the only one with the gear, the dog, and the soul hardened enough to walk into that white scream. "Stay here," Orrin commanded. "Tend the stove. If I'm not back in 2 hours, keep the lantern in the window." "You can't go out there," Marin whispered, even as she reached for a blanket. "You can't see your own hand in front of your face." Orrin looked at Sable. The German shepherd's eyes were amber and steady, reflecting the orange glow of the fire. "I won't be looking with my eyes," he said. Orrin moved with the efficiency of a man returning to a familiar battlefield. He pulled on his heavy, insulated bibs, a thermal face mask, and high-altitude goggles. He grabbed a coil of climbing rope, snapping one end to his own tactical belt and the other to Sable's harness. He stuffed a thermos of heated broth and several emergency thermal wraps into his pack. He didn't say goodbye. He simply nodded to Marin, grabbed his heavy walking staff, and stepped back into the nightmare. The moment they cleared the threshold, the world vanished. There was no sky, no ground, no horizon, only a spinning, violent whiteness that felt like being trapped inside a giant frozen lung. The cold was an immediate stinging blade searching for any sliver of exposed skin. "Search, Sable. Find the trail," Orrin shouted, though his voice was instantly swallowed by the gale. He felt the tension on the rope. Sable didn't hesitate. While Orrin was blinded, the dog was navigating a world of scent and vibration. She could feel the packed earth beneath 4 feet of powder. She could smell the faint metallic tang of the cabin's tin roof somewhere in the distance. They moved like a single organism. Orrin leaned into the wind, his body angled at 45 degrees just to keep from being knocked over. Every step was a battle. The snow was waist-deep in drifts, a treacherous shifting sea that threatened to pull him down and bury him. His mind began to drift, the soul wound of his past flickering in the periphery of his consciousness. He remembered the mountains of his youth, the silence of fallen comrades who had simply sat down to rest and never stood up again. The wind sounded like their voices calling him to join them, telling him that the cold was a peaceful end. No, he thought, his jaw clenching so hard it ached. Not today. Not them. He felt a sharp tug on the rope. Sable had stopped. Orrin stumbled forward, his goggles fogging with his own labored breath. He wiped them and looked down. Sable was digging frantically at a mound of snow that looked like any other. Orrin plunged his staff into the drift. It hit something solid. Wood. He began to dig with his hands, moving the heavy crystalline powder until he found the corner of a window frame. Inside there was no light. The cabin was a tomb of ice. He found the door buried halfway up. He threw his shoulder against it once, twice, 3 times, until the frame groaned and gave way. He tumbled inside Sable, following close behind, and slammed the door shut against the pursuing wind. The silence inside was terrifying. It wasn't the warmth of his shed. It was the heavy, stagnant chill of a refrigerator. "Lysa," he called out, his voice sounding muffled and strange in the small space. He clicked on his tactical flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a heartbreaking scene. The family was huddled together on a single mattress in the center of the room. They were wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, but they weren't moving. Lysa was clutching Toby, her eyes half closed, her breath coming in shallow, ragged puffs. Her father Elias was slumped against the headboard, his skin a translucent, waxy blue. They were in the fading sleep, the final stage of hypothermia, where the body gives up the fight and invites the end. "Sable, wake them up," Oren commanded. The dog leaped onto the bed, barking loudly and licking at Toby's face. The boy stirred a small whimpering sound, escaping his lips. Oren knelt beside Lysa, shaking her shoulder firmly. "Lysa, look at me. You have to move. If you stay here, you'll fade away." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed. So tired," she murmured. "The fire. It went out. The fire is waiting for you at the shed," Oren said, his voice like iron. He didn't waste time. He pulled the thermal wraps from his pack, enveloping the boy and his mother. But the real challenge was Elias. The old man was unresponsive, his heart rate so slow it was barely detectable. He couldn't walk. Oren looked at the door, then back at the mountain of a man. Elias was heavy, and the wind outside was stronger than ever. "I've got you, soldier," Oren whispered, though Elias had never served. In this moment they were all in the same trench. Oren hoisted the elderly man onto his back, using the climbing rope to lash Elias's arms around his neck so he wouldn't slip. He then grabbed Toby's hand and pulled Lysa to her feet. "Hold on to the rope," Oren instructed Lysa, his voice commanding. "Do not let go of the rope. Sable will lead us. Just keep moving. If you stop, we all end here." They stepped out into the fury. The return journey was a descent into a frozen purgatory. Oren felt the crushing weight of Elias on his spine, the old man's head lolling against his shoulder. His legs burned like they were filled with molten lead, and every breath was a gasp of ice that seared his throat. Lysa stumbled, falling into the snow. Oren felt the jerk on the rope and stopped, bracing himself against a tree that groaned under the wind's pressure. He couldn't go back to help her without dropping Elias. "Sable, help her." The dog circled back, grabbing the sleeve of Lysa's coat in her teeth and tugging with a primal, fierce strength. It wasn't just a dog leading a human. It was a guardian, pulling a soul back from the brink. Inspired by the animal's resolve, Lysa found some hidden reservoir of strength and clawed her way back to her feet. The wind tried to tear them apart. It screamed, it pushed, it pelted them with ice that felt like gravel. But Oren was a pillar. He focused on the rhythm of Sable's haunches moving in front of him, the steady tension of the rope, and the faint rhythmic thud of Elias's heart against his back. He was no longer the crazy vet the town mocked. He was the bridge between the ending and the beginning. After what felt like an eternity, a faint golden glow appeared through the white haze. It was the lantern in the shed window, a small, defiant spark in the heart of the storm. Oren reached the door and kicked it open with the last of his strength. They tumbled into the warmth, a heap of frost-covered humanity and fur. Marin was there, instantly helping Lysa and Toby toward the stove. Oren lowered Elias onto a bed of blankets, his own breath coming in heaving sobs. He ripped off his goggles, his face red and raw from the wind, his eyelashes matted with ice. He looked at the family he had pulled from the jaws of the mountain. They were shivering, they were weak, but they were breathing. The fading sleep had been broken. Sable shook herself, sending a spray of ice crystals across the floor, and then immediately went to Toby, resting her head on the boy's lap. Oren leaned back against the wall, his body trembling with exhaustion. He looked at his hands, the hands that had built this sanctuary, the hands that had been laughed at by the people of Dunar Hollow. Those hands were now the only reason 3 generations of a family still existed. The silence of the shed was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of life, the crackle of the fire, the soft whimpers of the boy, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of survivors. Not this time. Oren whispered to the room, a ghost of a smile touching his cracked lips. Not this time. Scene 6. The Gathering of the Lost. The heavy timber door of the inner sanctum groaned as Oren heaved it shut, sliding the massive iron bolt into place. The sound was final, a metallic declaration that the world of ice stayed outside, and the world of life stayed within. Inside the air was a thick, fragrant soup of cedar smoke, dried herbs, and the overwhelming, glorious scent of dry heat. The inner room of the woodshed was not merely a storage space, it was a masterpiece of survival engineering. The walls were lined with reflective foil and thick wool batting, trapping every calorie of heat generated by the cast-iron stove that glowed a dull, reassuring cherry red in the corner. Marin Quill moved with practiced efficiency, stripping the ice-caked outer layers from Lysa Bell and young Toby. Get them close to the perimeter of the heat first. Marin directed, her voice steady despite her own shivering. Too fast and the pain will be unbearable. We need to wake their blood slowly. Oren knelt by Elias the grandfather. The old man's skin was the color of parchment, his breathing shallow and thready. Oren didn't use words. He simply wrapped Elias's frozen hands in a warm fleece cloth and held them between his own calloused palms. He felt the faint, rhythmic pulse of a life trying to claw its way back from the edge of the void. "You're okay," Elias Oren muttered, his voice gravelly from the cold. "The mountain didn't get you today." Sable the German shepherd acted as a living heater. She paced between the survivors, eventually settling her heavy, warm body across Toby's legs. The boy, whose face had been a mask of white terror, finally let out a jagged sob, the first sign that his spirit was returning to his body. But the sanctuary was not destined to remain a private one. Above the shrieking of the wind, a new sound emerged, a frantic, rhythmic thudding against the outer hull of the shed. It wasn't the branch of a tree or the debris of the storm. It was the sound of a human fist. Oren stood up, his joints popping. He shared a look with Marin. He hadn't expected the town to fail so quickly. He moved to the outer door, cracking it just enough to see into the white abyss. There, huddled like ghosts in the frozen mist, stood Elena Frost and her two small children. Their faces were smeared with soot. The heaters. Elena gasped her breath, a plume of silver. The town. People tried to burn whatever they had. A fire broke out at the apartments. We had nowhere to go. We remembered the lights in the woods. Oren didn't hesitate. He reached out a massive hand and hauled them inside, pulling them from the threshold of the fading sleep. As they collapsed onto the floor, the heat hitting them like a physical wave, Oren looked past them. Through the swirling snow, more shapes were appearing. These were the people of Dunar Hollow. The ones who had leaned out of their truck windows to mock him weeks ago. They were the ones who had called him a crazy vet and laughed at his pointless fortress. Now they were broken. They were draped in thin blankets, their designer winter gear proving useless against a storm that didn't care about brands. At the front of the group was Harlan Beck, the man who had been the loudest critic. His expensive coat was torn, and his beard was a matted mask of ice. He looked at Oren, his eyes wide with a mixture of shame and desperation. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His jaw was locked in a shiver that threatened to break his teeth. Marin stepped up behind Oren, her hand on her holster more out of habit than threat. "Oren, we only have so much wood. We only have so much space." Oren looked at the shivering crowd. He remembered his squad in the mountains years ago, the men he couldn't save because they were caught in the open, betrayed by a world that had turned white and silent. He looked at Harlan, then at the children huddled behind him. "Move the supplies to the corners," Oren commanded, his voice ringing out with the authority of a man who had reclaimed his purpose. "Stack the crates. Make room. We don't turn anyone away." He stepped back, opening the door wide. One by one, the lost stumbled into the light. The interior of the woodshed transformed. It was no longer a workshop. It became a cathedral of survival. The air grew humid with the breath of 20 people. Oren moved among them like a silent shadow, handing out tin cups of hot water and broth he had kept simmering on the back of the stove. There was no talk of the past. There were no "I told you so's." The gravity of the situation had stripped away everyone's ego. The people who had mocked Oren now looked at him with a reverence that bordered on awe. They watched how he moved, how he checked the ventilation, how he listened to the groaning of the roof beams, how he managed the precious fuel. Elena Frost sat with her children, her eyes fixed on the stove. "We thought we were so smart," she whispered, to no one in particular. "We thought the grid would always be there. We thought the town was enough." Oren stopped near her, his shadow falling across the wall. "The town is just a collection of walls, Elena," he said softly. "A home is only as strong as the person who sees the storm coming." As the night deepened, the storm outside reached a new level of ferocity. The wind began to scream a high-pitched, demonic wail that made the children cover their ears. Huge drifts of snow slammed against the side of the building, the weight of it enough to crush a normal house. But Oren's shed didn't flinch. The deep-set pilings and the angled roof which the locals had laughed at were now their only shield. Every time a gust hit, the structure hummed a low-frequency vibration that spoke of strength and foresight. In the center of the room, the Bell family was finally sleeping, their breathing deep and rhythmic. Toby was curled against Sable's flank, the dog's heartbeat a lullaby for the traumatized boy. Oren stood by the small, reinforced window, looking out into the nothingness. He was no longer the outcast of Dunar Hollow. He was the anchor. He felt the soul wound within him, the old pain of those he had lost in the past finally begin to scab over. He hadn't just built a shed. He had built a second chance. The gathering of the lost was complete. They were no longer neighbors who ignored each other on the street. They were a tribe, bound together by the warmth of a man they had once failed to understand. And as the world outside turned into a frozen wasteland, the heart of the woodshed beat with the steady, defiant pulse of life. Scene 7. The night the world froze. The world outside Dunar Hollow had ceased to be a landscape. It had become a white abyss. By midnight, the storm reached its terrifying zenith. This was no longer a weather event. It was a tectonic shift of the atmosphere. The wind did not just blow. It screamed with a primal predatory hunger, a sound like 1,000 freight trains derailing simultaneously in the sky. In the surrounding forest, the ancient pines, some of which had stood for a century, begun to surrender. The sound of their trunks snapping echoed through the whiteout, like rhythmic cannon fire, a grim percussion of nature reclaiming the land. Inside the woodshed, the atmosphere was thick with a hushed, trembling reverence. The air smelled of wood smoke, wet wool, and the faint, sharp scent of pine resin bleeding from the overheated logs. The 20 souls huddled within the inner sanctum remained silent, their eyes fixed on the man who had become their silent commander. Oren Calder moved through the cramped space with a quiet, practiced authority that spoke of a lifetime spent managing crises. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false hope. He offered order. Oren knelt by the wood stove, his movements rhythmic and economical. He opened the iron door, the orange light of the embers dancing across his weathered features, highlighting the deep lines of a man who had seen too much fading in his life. He added 2 split logs, no more, no less, ensuring the heat remained steady but the fuel lasted. He then moved to the water barrels, ladling out precise portions into tin cups. "Small sips," he murmured to Elena Frost as he handed her a cup for her youngest child. "Keep the core warm. Don't rush it." Elena looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and guilt. "I laughed at you, Oren," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "In the general store. I told the others you were losing your mind." Oren didn't flinch. He didn't even look for an apology. He simply adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. "The storm doesn't care who believed in it," he replied. "It only cares who is ready." Sayah. Suddenly the structure groaned. It was a deep, guttural sound, the scream of timber under impossible pressure. The massive accumulation of snow on the roof, now several feet thick and weighing tons, was testing the limits of Oren's engineering. The people inside froze. Lisa Bell clutched her son Toby closer to her chest. The elderly father looked toward the ceiling, his lips moving in a silent prayer. The shed creaked and shifted. A fine dust of sawdust drifted down from the rafters like golden snow in the lantern light. But the beams, those heavy hand-hewn oak pillars that Oren had dragged through the mud months ago, held. The specific angles of the roof, designed to distribute the weight toward the reinforced pilings, were doing exactly what he had calculated. The shed didn't break. It hummed, absorbing the energy of the storm and grounding it into the earth. "It's holding," Oren said, his voice a low anchor in the rising panic. "The wood is talking, but it isn't breaking. Trust the structure." Then came the Goliath. A massive atmospheric gust, a wall of wind moving at over 100 miles per hour, slammed into the north face of the shed. The impact was so violent that the entire building shuddered violently on its foundations. A lantern tipped, extinguished instantly by the vibration. For a heartbeat, the sound of the wind vanished, replaced by a vacuum-like silence as the pressure plummeted. Everyone held their breath. It felt as though the world had finally collapsed. In that moment of ultimate tension, Oren didn't cower. He moved to the heavy reinforced door, the weakest point of any fortress. He planted his boots firmly, his back against the timber, and gripped Sable's collar. The German shepherd stood rigid at his side. Her hackles raised a low growl, vibrating in her chest as she defied the elements alongside her master. Oren stood there, a human shield, his physical presence, a barrier between the people he had saved and the void outside. The gust passed. The shed settled back into its rhythmic creaking. The walls remained upright. The roof remained intact. The pointless woodshed had survived the worst the sky could throw at it. Oren let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders relaxing only slightly. He looked around the room, seeing the faces of his neighbors, the people who had mocked him, ignored him, and treated him like a ghost. Now they looked at him as if he were a miracle. "We stay awake," Oren commanded quietly, returning to the stove. "The peak has passed, but the cold is a patient predator. We keep the fire going. We keep each other moving." Outside, the forest continued to shatter, but inside the small, warm sanctuary, the silence was no longer one of fear. It was a silence of hushed reverence for the man who had seen the darkness coming and decided in his quiet way that he would not let it win. The soul wound Oren had carried for so long didn't hurt tonight. For the first time in years, he wasn't haunted by the ones he couldn't save. He was fueled by the ones he had. Inside the shed, the fire in the small stove had burned down to a steady, rhythmic glow of embers. Oren Calder sat on a wooden crate near the door, his hand resting on Sable's head. He hadn't slept for a single second. His eyes rimmed with the exhaustion of a man who had fought a war against the sky, watched the thin line of light creeping under the doorframe. Slowly, Oren stood up. His joints protested with a series of dull aches, a reminder of the hours he had spent standing as a human shield against the door. He reached for the heavy iron bolt, the metal frost-nipped and cold to the touch. With a sharp tug, he threw the bolt back. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. When he pushed the door open, the sheer intensity of the light forced everyone inside to shield their eyes. One by one, the survivors, the Bell family, Elena Frost, the children, and the others who had sought refuge in the madman's fortress, stumbled toward the threshold. They stepped out into a world that looked nothing like the one they had left behind. The forest was a cathedral of glass. The snow had drifted so high that the ground floor windows of the distant town were likely entirely submerged. From their vantage point on the ridge, they looked down toward Dunar Hollow. The town was paralyzed. No smoke rose from the chimneys, for the wood was wet and the spirits were broken. The main road was a white river of impassable drifts. The town was a ghost of itself, a silent monument to the fragility of human comfort. "Look," Lysabel whispered, clutching her son's hand. Her voice was thick with emotion. We made it." In the distance, the low hum of engines began to vibrate through the frozen air. It was the sound of heavy-duty rescue, snowmobiles, and tracked vehicles clawing their way up from the valley floor. The authorities had finally mobilized, but as they reached the higher elevations, the rescuers slowed their pace. They had expected to find a trail of tragedy. Instead, they saw a plume of thin gray smoke rising steadily from a structure that shouldn't have been there. As the rescue crews reached the clearing, their faces were masks of disbelief. They saw the reinforced angles of the shed, the way it had been positioned to deflect the worst of the northern gusts, and the crowd of warm living souls standing on its porch. Among the rescuers was a group of locals who had managed to dig themselves out. At the front of the group walked Harlan Beck. He was the man who weeks ago had leaned out of his truck window to laugh at Oren's pointless labor. Now Harlan looked different. His expensive winter gear was torn, his face was pale and shadowed by a night of terror, and his pride had been stripped away by the sheer indifference of the storm. Harlan stopped several feet from the shed. He looked at the sturdy timber, then at the neighbors, who were now being wrapped in blankets by the rescue team. Finally, his gaze landed on Oren. Oren stood at the edge of the porch, sable at his side, looking neither triumphant nor angry. He simply looked like a man who had done what was necessary. Harlan's head bowed. The silence between the two men stretched out heavy with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. Oren Harlan began, his voice cracking. He took a step forward, his boots crunching loudly in the pristine snow. We were trapped in the basement when the roof of the tavern gave way. We thought the whole town was going to be lost to the cold. I didn't think anyone could survive up here on the ridge. He looked up, his eyes, glassy with a mix of shame and gratitude. I called you a fool. I told everyone you were wasting your life on a pile of wood. But if it wasn't for this place, if it wasn't for you. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. You were right. We weren't ready. None of us were. The crowd went quiet, waiting for Oren's response. Many expected him to lash out to remind them of their mockery, or to turn his back on the town that had treated him like an outcast. But the soul wound that Oren had carried since his time in the service, the memory of those he couldn't save, had been cauterized by the lives he had protected through the night. He had no room left for bitterness. Oren didn't say a word about the past. He didn't acknowledge the apology with a nod of ego. Instead, he turned and walked back into the shed. He reached into the neatly stacked pile of seasoned oak, the wood he had labored over for months, and picked up a single heavy log. It was dry, solid, and held the potential for a powerful heat. He walked back to the edge of the porch and held the log out to Harlan. The sun is out, but the warmth won't last, Oren said, his voice low and steady. The town is frozen, Harlan. The people are shivering in their beds, and the wet wood won't catch. Harlan reached out with trembling hands and took the log. It was surprisingly heavy, a piece of the foundation Oren had built in silence. Now you know how to start the rebuilding, Oren said. Take the dry wood. Share it. Don't wait for the next storm to decide you need a fire. Start it now while the light is still here. Harlan gripped the log to his chest as if it were a sacred relic. He looked at the other men behind him and then back at Oren. The dynamic of Dunar Hollow had shifted in that moment. The crazy vet was no longer the man they avoided. He was the only one who had known the way home through the whiteout. The rescue crews began to organize the transport of the survivors back down to the valley, but the atmosphere had changed. There was no more laughter, no more mocking whispers. There was only a profound, humbled respect. As the sun climbed higher, turning the diamond field into a world of melting gold, Oren watched them go. He remained on the ridge, a sentinel of the north, knowing that while the storm had passed, the lesson had just begun. The shed stood firm, a beacon of life in a frozen world, and for the first time in a very long time, Oren Calder felt at peace with the horizon. Scene 9. The Veteran's Legacy. The iron grip of winter had finally begun to loosen its hold on Dunar Hollow. The once suffocating ash-gray sky had given way to a brilliant, piercing blue, and the relentless howling of the wind was replaced by the rhythmic, musical dripping of melting ice. Small rivulets of water carved paths through the receding snowbanks, revealing the bruised but resilient earth beneath. The diamond field of the previous weeks was softening, turning into a landscape of transition. In the center of the clearing stood the shed, the structure that had once been the target of every joke in the valley. It no longer looked like a crazy man's folly. To the people of Dunar Hollow, it looked like a cathedral. Its timber was seasoned by the storm, its foundation settled firmly into the ground, and its walls bore the invisible weight of the lives it had protected. Oren Calder stood by the heavy door, but he was no longer alone with his silence. A group of townspeople had gathered around him. Among them was Harlan Beck, the man who had first mocked Oren's woodshed. Today, Harlan didn't carry a smirk. He carried a worn leather notebook and a measuring tape. Beside him stood Elena Frost, the mother who had found refuge in the shed's warmth, holding the hands of her children, who now looked at Oren with wide, adoring eyes. Oren wasn't lecturing from a podium. He was kneeling in the mud, his calloused hands tracing the grain of a support beam. He was showing them the soul of the structure. "Appearance is a lie. The sun tells you when the weather is fair," Oren said, his voice gravelly but clear. The townspeople leaned in, hanging on every word. "You don't build for the days when the birds are singing. You build for the night when the world decides to turn its back on you. You build for the weight of the snow that hasn't fallen yet." He showed them how to angle the roof so the snow would slide off before it could crush the frame. He explained the importance of the inner sanctum, a space within a space where the heat of a single small stove could be trapped and held like a precious secret. He taught them about the integrity of the frame, explaining that a building is only as strong as its connections. Marinquill, the ranger, stood at the edge of the crowd, a small smile playing on her lips. She had seen Oren as a survivor from the start, but now she saw him as something more, a cornerstone of the community. He was no longer the outcast vet, haunted by the soul wounds of his past. By teaching others how to survive, he was finally healing the parts of himself that had been frozen for decades. "The wood has to breathe," Oren continued, moving to a stack of timber. "If you seal it too tight, it rots from the inside. It's the same with a town. If you only look at the pretty paint on the outside and forget the bones of the house, you'll fall when the first branch breaks." Harlan Beck stepped forward, nodding slowly as he took notes. "We spent so much time worrying about how our homes looked from the road, Oren. We never thought about how they would feel when the power went out and the thermometer bottomed out. Thank you for not closing the door on us." Oren looked Harlan in the eye. There was no resentment there, only a quiet, shared understanding. "The door was built to be opened, Harlan. That's why I put the hinges on the inside." As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the ridges, the townspeople began to disperse, carrying their notebooks and their newfound wisdom back toward Dunar Hollow. They weren't just going back to repair their houses. They were going back to build a different kind of town, one built for endurance, for foresight, and for the reality of the horizon. The shed remained in the clearing, a monument to the miracle of preparation. It would stay there for years, eventually becoming a local landmark, a place where people would come to remember the winter the world froze and the man who saw it coming. Oren walked to the edge of the ridge, Sable trotting faithfully at his side. The German shepherd sat down, her ears perked, her gaze fixed on the valley below, where the first thin plumes of smoke were rising from the town's chimneys, smoke from fires built with dry wood in stoves that were now being properly vented. Oren rested his hand on Sable's head. The soul wound that had once throbbed with the memory of lost comrades in a distant cold land was finally quiet. He had kept his promise. He had been prepared. And this time no one had been left behind in the dark. The narrator's voice echoes over the final scene. They say that God often sends his warnings through the hands of those who have already walked through the darkness. For Dunar Hollow, that warning was a man with a hammer and a heart that refused to forget. True safety is not found in the absence of the storm, but in the promises we keep before the first flake of snow hits the ground. Oren Calder didn't just build a shed. He built a legacy of silence that spoke louder than any shout, a reminder that to be ready is the greatest act of love one can offer to their neighbor. As the screen fades to black, the only sound is the gentle, steady dripping of the thaw and the soft, contented sigh of a dog at rest.